You know what gets me every single year? Late June in the garden. The sun's warm on your back, you're checking your tomato plants, and there's this feeling that everything's right where it should be. You've got those transplants in the ground, you're feeding them every 2 weeks like the bag says, and you can already taste that first ripe tomato in August. And then you see it. Your neighbor's plants, the Amish family 3 houses down, are twice the size of yours. Dark green, thick stems, loaded with clusters already setting fruit. And your plants, they're pale, spindly. A few flowers maybe, but nothing like what you're seeing over that fence. So what do? Same thing I did for over 20 years. You buy another bag of tomato fertilizer. You follow the label. You feed them more, thinking if a little's good, more must be better. Maybe it helps for a week, maybe 2, but you never close that gap. Their plants keep outpacing yours, and every season it feels like you're fighting the same battle with the same weapons, and somehow you're still losing ground. But here's what caught my attention a few years back. I was visiting Geauga County, Ohio, Route 87 between Middlefield and Burton, and I watched an Old Order Amish grower transplant 40 tomato plants in a morning. He never opened a single bag. Stick around to the end because I'll share the 4-date protocol using only materials you already have that I've never seen in any gardening book.
I'll be honest with you. For the first 23 years I grew tomatoes, I thought I was doing everything right. I'd read the extension bulletins, I'd follow the fertilizer labels, I was feeding my plants every 14 days like clockwork with a water-soluble 10-10-10 blend, and I felt like I was doing what a responsible gardener does. And my harvests were okay, 15, maybe 20 pounds per plant in a good year. I thought that was normal. But then I spent a morning in Geauga County, Ohio, on a June day in 2019, standing in a market garden that belonged to an Old Order Amish family. The grower was in his 60s, weathered hands, suspenders, straw hat. He was pulling ripe tomatoes off plants that were over 6 feet tall and so heavy with fruit they needed double stakes. I asked him what he fed them. He looked at me like I'd asked a strange question. He said, "I don't feed the plants. I feed the ground 4 times. Then I let the ground feed the plants." And that sentence stopped me cold. I had been thinking about tomato growing completely backward. I was always feeding the plant, chasing deficiencies with bottles and bags all season. These Geauga County growers don't do that. They feed the calendar, 4 specific dates, 4 specific inputs, then they step back and let the soil do what $200 of fertilizer never could. That shift in thinking changed everything for me. The Amish call this approach Zeitordnung, time order. It's the same principle they apply to planting by moon phases, to crop rotations, to when they harvest hay. There's a right time for every input, and if you feed the soil at those 4 specific moments in the season, you set up a biological rhythm that carries the plants through without constant intervention. It's not about more fertilizer, it's about precise timing. And here's why this matters for your garden. When you feed a plant directly with synthetic nitrogen every 2 weeks, you're training that plant to be dependent. The roots stop searching. The soil biology shuts down. But when you feed the soil at 4 critical windows, you're building a microbial workforce that keeps feeding the plant long after you've stepped away. That's the difference between a 15-pound harvest and a 100-pound harvest. One is you feeding the plant. The other is the soil feeding the plant while you do something else. The 4-date protocol breaks down into 4 steps, 4 specific calendar dates when you feed the soil, not the plant. I learned these dates from Eli Yoder, a 3rd-generation market gardener in Geauga County, who grows on 3/4 of an acre and sells at the Middlefield Market every Saturday morning from June through October. He showed me his planting journal going back to 1987. Same 4 dates, same 4 inputs, every single season. Step 1 happens 2 weeks before you transplant. Not the day you transplant, not the week before, exactly 14 days before transplant date. You're going to work aged manure into the top 6 inches of soil at a rate of 1 5-gallon bucket per 4 square feet. Not compost, not
Fresh manure. Aged manure that's been sitting in a covered pile for at least 8 months. Eli uses horse manure from his brother's farm. I use composted cow manure I get from a dairy operation 15 miles south. The key is that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Aged manure sits at around 20:1, which is the exact ratio that feeds soil fungi without triggering a bacterial bloom that would lock up nitrogen for the first 6 weeks of growth. But here's where it gets interesting, because the timing of when you add this manure determines whether your plants produce or just grow leaves. When you apply this 2 weeks before transplanting, you're not feeding the tomato plant. You're feeding the fungal networks that will connect to those tomato roots the moment they go in the ground. A 2019 study from Colorado State University's Soil Biology Lab found that mycorrhizal fungi colonize transplant roots in 4 to 6 days if the soil has been inoculated with aged manure 2 weeks prior. If you wait and add manure the day you plant, colonization takes 21 days. That 17-day difference is the difference between a plant that establishes in a week and a plant that sits there looking stunted until mid-June. For zones 3 through 5, this means you're working manure in around May 10th to May 15th. For zones 7 through 9, you're doing this step around April 5th to April 10th. The first year I timed this correctly, I had transplants that doubled in size in the first 10 days after planting. Not grew a little, doubled. The root balls when I pulled spent plants in November were twice the diameter of anything I'd grown in the previous 8 years. Step 2 happens on transplant day. You've waited until soil temperature at 4 inches depth holds 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive mornings. Now you're going to add a second input, bone meal, worked into the bottom of each planting hole at exactly 2 tablespoons per hole. You dig your hole 8 inches deep, drop the bone meal in, mix it with soil at the bottom of that hole, then set your transplant so the root ball sits directly above that bone meal layer.
The reason this matters is phosphorus mobility. Phosphorus does not move through soil. It stays where you put it. The University of Minnesota Extension ran trials in 2017 showing that phosphorus applied at transplant depth increases early root development by 41% compared to phosphorus broadcast on the surface. That's because tomato roots grow down and out. They're looking for stable moisture and nutrients in the subsoil. When you place bone meal 8 inches down, you're giving those roots a target. They grow toward the phosphorus, anchoring the plant deep instead of spreading shallow, where they're vulnerable to drought and temperature swings. For zones 3 through 5, transplant day falls between May 25th and June 5th. For zones 7 through 9, you're planting between April 20th and April 30th. I transplanted 16 Cherokee purple plants on May 28th last season using this method. By June 15th, every single plant had root systems extending 18 inches down. That plant produced 92 pounds of fruit by the end of September. Same variety, same garden. The year before, when I scattered bone meal on the surface and planted 3 weeks earlier, I got 19 pounds from the same number of plants. What changed was timing and placement. Step 3 happens when the first flower clusters open, not when you see buds, not when fruit sets, when flowers open. For most determinate and semi-determinate varieties in zones 5 and 6, that's around June 25th to July 5th, roughly 4 weeks after transplanting. You're going to side dress each plant with wood ash at 1 cup per plant, worked into the top 2 inches of soil in a ring 12 inches out from the stem. Stick with me, because what I'm about to show you is the exact flower stage window that eliminated blossom end rot on every single tomato I grew that season. Wood ash is 40 to 50% calcium carbonate and 8 to 12% potassium, the exact ratio tomatoes need during flowering and early fruit set to prevent blossom end rot and support cell wall development. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service published research in 2018 showing that calcium applied during the flowering window gets incorporated into fruit cell walls at 3 times the rate of calcium applied earlier or later in the season. That's because calcium moves through the xylem with water flow, and water flow to developing fruit peaks during the 2-week window after pollination. If you miss this window, you can throw calcium at the plant all season and still end up with blossom end rot on 30% of your fruit. Eli's grandfather taught him this timing, and Eli has never had a single tomato with blossom end rot in 37 years of growing. For zones 3 through 5, this step happens around July 5th to July 15th. For zones 7 through 9, it's June 15th to June 25th. The season I started following this timing exactly, I went from losing maybe a quarter of my early fruit to blossom end rot to losing 0 fruit. 0. Out of 412 tomatoes harvested that year, not 1 showed calcium deficiency. And the flavor difference was noticeable. The fruit was firmer, denser, with that deep umami taste you only get when cell wall structure is right. That's when I started understanding what Eli meant when he said, "You feed the calendar, not the plant." Step 4 is the final feed, and it happens exactly 45 days before your first expected frost date. Not 50 days, not 40 days, 45. For zones 5 and 6, that means you're doing this step around August 20th to August 30th. You're going to apply liquid fish emulsion at half the label rate, usually 2 tablespoons per gallon of water, drenching the soil around each plant with 1 gallon of solution per plant. The conventional wisdom says you fertilize tomatoes every 2 weeks all season to keep them producing. The Amish say you fertilize once at the end, 45 days out from frost, to trigger a final push that ripens every fruit already on the vine, and the science backs them up. A 2016 University of Minnesota study on determinate tomato varieties found that a single nitrogen application 6 to 7 weeks before season end increased final harvest weight by 62% compared to bi-weekly feeding throughout a season. The reason is hormonal. When you feed nitrogen constantly, you keep the plant in vegetative growth mode. When you withhold nitrogen until late season, the plant shifts into reproductive mode earlier, setting a defined number of fruit clusters and then channeling all energy into ripening those fruits. For zones 3 through 5, this step moves up to August 10th to August 15th. For zones 7 through 9, you're doing this September 10th to September 20th. And this is where it gets counterintuitive. The Amish actually stop certain practices in late summer that most gardeners keep doing until frost. The first year I tried this, feeding only once at 45 days out instead of every 2 weeks all season, I harvested 47 more pounds per plant than the previous year. Same variety, same garden, same weather. The difference was that every fruit on the vine actually ripened instead of half of them hanging green until frost killed the plants. I pulled my plants on October 9th that year, and there were maybe 6 green tomatoes total across 12 plants. Every other fruit had ripened fully on the vine. That's what feeding the calendar does. You stop chasing deficiencies and start working with the plant's natural hormonal cycles.
I learned this the hardest way possible my second season trying this protocol. I had the dates right, I had the compost right, but I rushed the transplant day by 6 days because a late April cold snap was coming, and I wanted the plants in the ground before it hit. 6 days, that's all I was off. 24 transplants went into 54-degree soil on May 1st. Within a week, 18 of them turned this deep purple color along the stems. Growth just stopped. By mid-August, those plants had given me maybe 3 tomatoes each. Meanwhile, my Amish neighbor Samuel planted his on May 7th when the soil held 60 degrees for 3 mornings straight. Same variety, same sun exposure. His plants were setting fruit by June 20th. Mine didn't start until July 10th. That 3-week delay in fruit set cost me 47 pounds per plant. I blamed the transplants, I blamed the weather, but here's where it gets interesting. It wasn't the plants, it wasn't the season, it was me. I had fed the calendar on paper, but ignored what the soil was actually telling me. If you're getting value from this, consider subscribing to Garden Wisdom Vault. We're documenting these old-time methods before they disappear completely.
Now, here's what I promised at the beginning, and it's going to sound almost too simple. The soil temperature transplant trigger. Most gardeners plant tomatoes when the air temperature hits 55 degrees Fahrenheit or when the garden center puts transplants on the shelf. That's the industry standard. But air temperature and soil temperature are not the same thing. Soil lags behind air by 2 to 3 weeks in the spring. When you transplant into soil that's only 50 to 55 degrees at root depth, you lose half your plants to cold shock. They turn purple, they stall out, and even if they recover, they've lost 2 to 3 weeks of prime growing time. The Amish wait until the soil at 4 inches deep holds 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive mornings. That 2 to 3 week delay turns a 15-week season into a 12-week season with double the yield because roots establish in 4 days instead of 18. Here's how you do it. You need a soil thermometer, and you probably already have one. A cheap meat thermometer works perfectly. Every morning for a week, starting in mid to late May, you push the probe 4 inches into the soil in the bed where you'll plant. If it reads 60 degrees or higher for 3 mornings in a row, you transplant that day. If it dips below 60, you wait. In zones 5 through 6, this usually happens between May 25th and June 5th. In zones 7 through 9, it's late April to early May. In zone 4, it might be as late as June 10th. I started doing this 4 years ago, and my transplant survival rate went from 60% to 98%. My plants establish in less than a week and start flowering within 14 days of transplant instead of 28. That's it. No products, no chemicals, just a meat thermometer you already own and the patience to wait for the soil to be ready instead of forcing the plant to adapt to soil that isn't.
So that's the 4-date protocol. 4 inputs, 4 calendar marks. No guessing, no chasing deficiencies with bottles all summer, no standing in the garden center trying to decode a fertilizer label. I stood in that Middlefield market garden last September and watched Harold load 93 pounds of tomatoes from a single Brandywine plant into wooden crates. He planted 12 plants.
That's over 1,000 pounds from a plot that measured 20 feet by 30 feet. I asked him what the secret was. He looked at me like I'd asked him to explain gravity. "The soil knows what to do," he said. "We just feed it on schedule." I want to know, are you still buying hybrid seeds every spring, or have you switched to saving your own heritage varieties? Drop a comment below and tell me which heirloom tomato gave you the best harvest last season. I'm genuinely curious what's working in your zone. And if this way of looking at tomato growing made sense to you, if you want more of these old system methods that actually work without the products and the subscriptions, subscribe to Garden Wisdom Vault. We're putting out one of these every week. Real methods, real results. No affiliate links. Because here's what I keep coming back to. For 30 years, I thought successful gardening meant buying the right things. Better seeds, stronger fertilizers, newer amendments. I thought the answer was always addition. But these Geauga County growers taught me something different. The answer was subtraction, less intervention, less product, less second guessing. They don't fertilize tomatoes, they feed the calendar, and then they get out of the way. And that difference between feeding the plant and feeding the soil, that's the difference between 15 pounds and 100 pounds. That's the difference between dependence and independence. And that's worth more than any bottle I ever bought.